you're able to just ask. And from there, we'll figure it out. It could be about what I'm talking about. It could be about any problem you're having in terms of product or research or hiring or just anything in tech. And we'll try to do our best to solve it. So let's jump in. The first thing that to get us all started into the idea of really sharing learnings is to start by saying, look, I'm not the only person presenting here. I'm not the only person that's learned something this month. And so I want us to start by typing into the chat over the next few minutes, what's something you've learned in the last month? And so I'll set the timer, I'll put the music back on and jump right in. I think I'm gonna let it play for another 30 seconds.
So, social
All right, all right. Wow. There's some really cool stuff in that chat. And some later arrivals, Gary Cohen talking about value stream mapping. Yeah, that's interesting. Just even getting that last comment. It's a lot of work to get the right people into the room, to especially depending on how big that value stream that you're trying to map is. It's going to be a process that people don't really know. And there's going to be a high barrier, high cost of entry for people to get bought in. And not only to do that, but also the follow-up. Sometimes there's going to be, there got to be different things that you're going to have to try in order to understand how an organization works. And so, yeah, different tools. Carrie, I've been in that situation before. And quite the learning. Yeah, got some stuff about AI, some system stuff. Yeah, this is really cool. I really love, I think this is quickly becoming the favorite part of the conversation because I love learning what everyone else is learning because it's, yeah, I don't know everything. And by far, there's so much for me to learn. I'm always naturally curious. So thank you, everyone that shared something because you've given me some homework. You got me some homework. I love homework. All right. Let's chat about a couple of things that I've learned and or have thought deeper about over the last month. And we'll go from there. So the first one is about sensing metrics. And the reason why this came up for me is I've been working on this concept called survival metrics for about 2.5 years now. And one of the pitfalls I've noticed with teams as I've worked with them around metrics is that teams find it difficult to figure out how metrics can get people to move, how metrics can get people to act. Far too often, there are metrics that folks just put out there, right? It's a number that's qualified or quantifying some sort of goal. Oftentimes you're lucky if it's quantifying some sort of goal that's tied into some sort of problem, but they tend to miss the mark because they don't drive action. And if the stuff that you put out don't drive action and don't help the people that are looking at it, then they tend to ignore it. And rightfully so. We have so much information coming into us. And so I've thought about this concept called sensing metrics, which are contextualized metrics that help spur action. And so when I'm talking about leveling up metrics, I think adding some ways, some markers that help people put that metric somewhere in their heads is super useful. And the 3 ways to do that, to me, are being time bound. And so you can create a sense of urgency by saying, hey, this metric is only valid for X amount of time. And so if you're going to use this number, it has a drop dead date. It has an expiration date. And so that gives folks a natural sense of urgency. Now, I wouldn't recommend just creating one out of thin air. It has to be tied to something. However, you want to make sure that it has some sense of urgency to it, whatever metric you use, to give people a space, a container, which to put that information in. You also want to tell a story about the metric, and so you want to contextualize it based on the other metrics that it affects. If your metric is a metric on an island as it's on its own, that's a problem, generally. You're generally talking about a metric that isn't really tied to anything. Think about the metrics that happened before, right? And some might call this your leading metrics, what leads into that metric, and then what happens to that metric afterwards. Some folks may call that your lagging metrics. And so think about how you could draw a metric map to contextualize that metric for people as you tell that story. And then you want to tie it to your strategy. I said a few moments ago that folks have a problem in tying their metric to something. And those things that your metric should be tied to are your problem, which I call your push, right? What is pushing you into tracking this metric? And what goal does it affect or your pull? What is pulling your metric in a certain direction? There are also some other ways of doing this. There's a frame that I have here where you can say, hey, your status changes on a project, on a product. You can say this metric will change X. That status change is helpful to contextualize it even further for folks. And then that time structure, again, back to saying this is going to happen within 2 weeks, which some teams will qualify as a sprint, maybe a week, maybe 6 months, maybe a month, but just give it some sort of time structure. And this sentence here, this metric will change X if Y doesn't happen in 2 weeks, impacting our ability to accomplish Z, right? That's your, as you can see, stuff like this can start to stack and give whoever's reading this metric an opportunity to understand what this metric is and how it affects their work. Because ultimately, metrics are communication tools, no different than a roadmap or a strategy to help people go into the right direction. And you can to increase the ability of the folks around you to have more context and help drive decision making, you should. And so these sensing metrics are missing to drive action. Ask yourself, can the team around you have a lever to know how to act? Is there a lever that they can pull based on the information that you're giving them, the data that you're giving them, in order to make something happen? And so just to get a check to see if that resonated with folks, could I get a 1 in the chat if that was helpful to you? And if you have a question, I'll take a break for a second to help you write down. We'll go to the music here. Feel free to drop some comments or questions in the chat, which we can deal with later. All right, awesome. So let's talk about something next, which has been also tied to survival metrics, which is sunk costs. And this concept I'm calling the strategy pie. I don't really have a better name for it right now, but really what this is all about is what is the effect of sunk costs as it relates to the teams that you're working with? And what sunk cost is, the sunk cost fallacy describes our tendency to follow through on endeavors if we've already invested time, money, effort into it, even though it has no effect on the endeavor's success. Unfortunately, a lot of product teams end up working in this manner. And it's one of the things that has pushed me to create survival metrics. Over my career, what I've noticed is people will just say yes to avoid tension. And there are a lot of psychological effects that drive that. And some of those psychological effects are loss aversion, which is a preference and tendency to avoid loss over equivalent gain. It's framing, cognitive bias to avoid risk with a positive frame and accept risk with a negative frame. Over optimistic probability bias, prescriptions that increase future returns on investment if I did something because I paid a cost to it, it's going to give us more of an ROI, which is not true. Responsibility, connecting the investment and effort with an individual or group directly involved. Wasteful, a desire to avoid being judged as having wasted time, resources, or cost investment and an effort. And so there are a lot of things here in this list of 5 things, whether it's how you feel, how you believe people will perceive you, some of our natural human tendencies to avoid feeling like we lost. It's a mix of things. Also not on here that may be driving it is your bosses, right? You might be in an environment where you can't say no. And so I don't want to forget that as well. And so that creates this, right, sunk cost, where in this example, you're talking about $10,000 on a development for a new cell phone. And, you know, that $10,000 is gone, but your teams are still trying to spend money. They're still marketing that cell phone. They're still operating that cell phone. They still have a cost associated with maintaining that cell phone, right? Every minute that you're working on that is wasted. Now, let's put that in context with tech. You're talking about not $10,000. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're talking about millions of dollars in some cases, sometimes tens of millions of dollars. And so as I think about what your strategic pie is, and an ideal world, you have some sort of breakdown where you're placing bets and holding resources to maintenance, innovation, iteration, communication, and building, right? These are things that your product team should be focused on at all times. Now, sometimes it's not going to be even. For a lot of teams, they over-index on one of these, probably maintenance or probably building. They don't take time to do iteration. However, sunk cost at its core eats into this 20% pie of what health is and starts to take away from each of these ways of doing things or each of these methods or each of these operations that your team has to do in order to stay relevant and building towards customers. And so a percentage of sunk cost isn't a percentage away from one of these things. It's a percentage away from all of these things. Yet, and as you look through the pie to the right, a lot of teams, unfortunately, right, this sunk cost of 75% is real, right? They're maintaining products that don't really push the needle for them. They're building on things that don't drive anything, and no one wants to move them for fear of running into any of these or looking at any of these. And so one thing that I'm going to continue working on and putting into context as you look at these pies is more conversations as we go on through the months, what these effects are. And if you'd like to talk about that or sunk cost that's happening in your company right now, I'd love to take 15, 20 minutes and just talk about it with you or what you've noticed in the past. I want to start getting some more information and data and anecdotes around this. If you're interested, please let me know, or when we take this a second to write into the chat, just write into the chat if you're interested, and I'll reach. One of the other things that is super duper top of mind as I look at this is it's really important for teams to have time dedicated to removing things that are sunk costs and to be thoughtful about that and having conversations around that. Our retrospectives and often talk about what could have gone better or how our teams are doing if they're like even a level higher, right? What I mean by level higher is I think teams that are just doing standard retrospectives are like level 1. where they're just looking at the work. I think teams that look at the team itself are like level 2. I think level 3 is adding into this idea of sunk cost and where are things really pulling or sapping our strength, and having ways and of identifying and chopping off this 75%, because again, once as you take away from this pie, you open up all the other things to the left. You're able to do more of that. And so the implication here is removing something is worth much more than adding something. You should be creating spaces to formally eject sunk costs to find soft revenue. And I'll define soft revenue as opportunity cost, or just lowering things like maintenance costs, which often aren't considered when teams are talking about revenue. Because if you're thinking about the profit, what profit equals, profit is, what's it, revenue minus cost. And so ejecting sunk costs will rise the revenue and create more profit. I'm going to pause here, put a 2 in the chat if that was helpful, and also put your email down if you'd like to talk about this more. All right, awesome. The last one is going to be more of a general thing, which is content. And so there's something that, for those who weren't here last month, I was invited to sit with Marty Kagan and the Silicon Valley product team for their Coaching the Coaches event, which basically brought a bunch of people in from around the country. It was about 50 of us. Actually, it's international. I would say probably 10 of the 50 were from countries like South Africa or Australia and South America. So we sat down and we talked a lot about how do you help teams. And I think the stuff that we talked about, some of it was relevant for full-time coaches like myself, but also some of it was very relevant for folks working internal to teams. And one thing that Marty talked about that I think is relevant to everyone is content. And so he said, if you want to have some viability to the people around you, you have to have the content. Now, content can mean many things. I think the thing that stands out to me is that you got to have some form of something to hand to someone to say, hey, this is how you help. This is a starting point for your problem. And again, I think that's relevant for anyone working inside of a company. If I have, whether it's on a website or whether it's internal, right? If there's a common problem and I hand you something and say, okay, this is something that we've solved before, more likely that person is going to trust you a bit more than the other person that just says, hey, let's talk about this. And they're definitely going to trust those two people a lot more than somebody that doesn't say anything. How do we generate content? I think there are a few paths, but one thing that I've been engaging with recently has been LinkedIn and YouTube. as ways to just try to explore what content could look like. And I know for my context, it's been more towards coaching and understanding things, but stuff has happened as I've created these assets, these pieces of content. And what it's done is it's allowed me to try to figure out what I'm actually saying. So I've gotten a chance to experiment, testing out the theories that I have, or working through some of the problems that I've seen by trying to make something out of it, whether that's writing it, whether that's creating a video, which I found to be super helpful, or even just having a conversation with someone over a podcast or just anything. Because that anything leads to new tools and language. Every tool that I've had to use in order to create this has helped me learn another way to try something. And I think even more important, it's helped me learn another way to explain it. Because the work that we do, especially as product people, whether you're a product designer, a product manager, or even a product engineer, is you're working in these complex environments where there isn't a right answer, so to speak. And so what that generally means is you're going to need different ways of explaining what's in front of you. And every time you try to make some content, again, this could be public or private. This can be in-house. Another way I've experimented this when I was a product leader was to use Slack. Use the Slack tools that are available. For example, if you didn't know, Slack allows you to create video inside of the application. I used to send videos with content to my direct reports on a regular basis because it allowed me to try a new tool and to have a new language of explaining something a problem that we're dealing with, which leads into connection. That connection, what you're struggling with is someone else's breakthrough, no matter where you are in your career. And so there's an opportunity, I think, for folks to just try to make something. It could be a paragraph, it could be a small video, it can be a TikTok, it could be anything, but what you're doing will land with someone, and that'll create their breakthrough. And all this is useful for your career as you're dealing with complex issues. These things of being able, learning how to experiment, learning how to work through new tools and language, and building connection are things that help both outside and inside of work. And I offer you the challenge to just try to make something. Doesn't need to go viral, doesn't need to be big, but just trying to get into the habit every day of making something, creating something can be extremely beneficial to the work that you're doing. And so the implication here is working on communication skills by leveraging different media can transfer back into positive success. You're gaining a language in which to explain yourself. And so I'm going to pause here again and drop a 3 if that was useful, as well as any questions. All right. And so now we're opening up to Q&A. Quite simply, What are your questions? What are your questions? What are your questions? Oh, wait, before, as you start to generate questions, I'd love to get some feedback on the session here as it stands, as well as this is also another place for you to ask questions. I'm just gonna set the timer here for 2 minutes. I want you to think, I want you to fill out this Google form. I want you to get up, I want you to stretch, and then we're gonna come back at 40, and it's going to be all Q&A from there. Go ahead, fill out this feedback form, get some water, stretch, and then we're gonna jump into Q&A. All right, we are here at Q&A. Anybody have questions they want to throw? It can be about anything we've talked about today. It can be any problem you have with product, anything you're exploring. Either way, let me know what's on your mind. Feel free to raise your hand or come off of mute. All right, Valerie, you're up.
Hi, thanks for creating this container for us and sharing all of these super interesting and supportive insights around strategy. So I come from the space of like climate, environmental justice, and I'm very curious about the possibility to realize further the tech space or generally use this strategic framework towards like this idea of impact and like climate response. So I'm curious whether that's something you have engaged with or thought about or come across people who yeah engage that in more specific ways.
So yeah, I've thought a lot about what can tech do, not just looking forward as to what is the ability of technical solutions in order to deal with some of the ecological issues that we're seeing right now, whether that's food shortages, climate change, things like nuclear waste, COVID, right? The world is, I think it's clear the world is sick. And we have an ability, I think, with tech to try to figure out ways in which to solve it. I haven't quite run into a collective in which I'm more than happy to talk over email about what you've seen. I've I've looked for folks like I had worked with a so I saw that like companies like BP are trying to do clean tech right now. And so like larger companies I think are starting to consider it, but I'm also more interested in seeing like who else or where else these solutions are coming from. But personally, I've thought about it. I haven't seen um and this is probably out of pure ignorance, I haven't seen any collectors or folks that are doing much. And yeah, what do I think about strategy? I think strategy is useful for everything. I think what these companies or what clean tech um, clean tech is no different than any other form of tech, except I think the ramifications of it or the stakes are certainly higher. I think right now, based on the fact that we're in a problem rich environment, understanding where to focus and how to focus, and then how to partner with other companies that are focusing on things that are adjacent to whatever a company is focusing on is going to be super important in the future. Right? It's going to take multiple minds to fix these problems, not just one. And strategy will be a lever in which teams can use to help solve that, right? Because with good strategy, you're really focused on a particular problem. And those other companies or companies around it or these collectives will also be focused on particular problems. And since you're not in competition with each other, the insights that each of these companies get can help level up the other companies that are around it. So I guess maybe that's it. I'm rambling a bit, but I think there's an opportunity to change the frame and how companies talk to each other and engage with each other, since the work that they're doing is particularly sensitive to and um, time sensitive, right? The world is dying now in order to solve some of these issues that we see.
Thank you.
Also, would love to follow up and chat a bit more. I saw you put your email down there for this on cost conversation. I'd love to also talk more about this with you. And do you know any like collectives that are or companies? I'd love to chat and help with strategy or whatever I could.
Yeah, there's a number of like VC oriented communities. So more focused on the early stage, but also developing forms of education. But I haven't seen in there such a focus on strategy, which just makes me curious because it feels like strategy is a mechanism that can scale these efforts and also that can then just strengthen the approach, like the decision-making approach. So there's various that come to mind. I think the first one would be My Climate Journey. They have a really great podcast and they have a Slack. They're connected to two other communities, like they all look at each other. There's one called Terra That Do, so they've been onboarding people in the tech space and in other spaces towards understanding climate. And they're more of their school, and I don't think they cover per se. So that makes me curious. And the third one is Work on Climate. They have also a really large Slack. It's actually an ex-Google who started it towards onboarding people towards that response. Yeah, it was just, and all these people are really like tech adjacent. So but they don't engage with strategy in the way that you do, and they don't develop these like super helpful frameworks that allow you to think in situations. They more look to onboard people towards, the climate tech startup space or more established climate tech firms like Watershed, or towards supporting the connection between VC and early stage folks who they have like sets of interests and they have other expertise and strategy, typically, those people. So I was just curious about how these two conversations meet, and because it seems like it could be just like important or helpful.
100%, right? It's good to get people into a place, but eventually you're going to have to go make bets on what you're trying to accomplish. And yeah, we got the folks in, but how do we leverage the folks that are around us to make meaningful change? And yeah, if you know anyone, or I'm certainly happy to have conversations or point it into the direction. But yeah, I'd love to talk more. I've gotten a lot of links here. It's very exciting. I'm going to dig in. Are these Slacks?
Yeah, most of them. I think My Climate Journey might have a one-time fee, but Work on Climate is completely open. That there's another one. Yeah, there's a lot when you start like connecting with them. But I maybe start with Work on Climate. It's really dynamic and completely free.
Okay, cool. Yeah. That sounds good. I'd love to jump in there and just see what I see. Awesome. Thank you, Valerie.
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else have questions? Jump in. You don't need to turn your camera on. You can do the audio only. All right, I see Gio came off of mute. Awesome.
I'm not entirely sure if I can ask this question because it might be a little too basic. I'm just getting started in metrics, and I'm working as a product manager in a services company here. So we have a client who is involved in let's say corporate dining, like making booking available for corporate companies and restaurants and hotels and things like that. So right now, what happens a lot is that we just go in terms of development, we just build things on the basis of request, like they would like this feature or add a filter here, or maybe put in something else here. So it feels a little bit directionless. And in terms of metrics, there's pretty much nothing other than the revenue numbers that the business side keeps track of. So I was just wondering if like you could let me know your thoughts and what's a good way to get started and what's a good way to make the business side understand the importance of setting up metrics and also in general giving things direction, making changes measurable. I know that's a lot of questions, but yeah.
It's a lot, but I'm here to help. So the first thing I wanted to share with you, as you were talking about companies in which they are super duper focused on just responding to inquiries, right? Or just using feedback to create the roadmap. I wrote an article on this called Beware the Tyranny of Customer Feedback. I'm going to drop that into the chat.
That's exactly the situation here. So the business side talks to the customers, be it venues or the clients who are booking the venues. And we pretty much go off of, hey, this person said that it would be nice to have this here. And then it just goes in that direction.
And so I think what's super helpful with companies, and I'm again, like if you want to book an office hours to talk about this more in depth, I'm into it. But you can find that here. Or wait, drop your email in the chat and I'll send you a link towards it. And yeah, I think the first thing that's super helpful is to ask them before you get into metrics, asking what type of company. Okay, all things equal, where do you see this company in 2 to 3 years? What's super duper important to you right now? And so you're going to get a bunch of answers from people. And then I think it'll be a great thing as a, I'm assuming you're the product person here working on it. What I think would be great is to take those ideas and then try to cobble together a story. Like, what's the story of the company here as of now and in this future that they want to build? And so what you've started is like a vision, and you can get people to agree on what this like kind of long-term vision thing is without you don't have to use numbers or anything, but just say, okay, this is the direction in which we want to go. That could be something that anchors people. And then from there, you want to work back into strategy. And let me see if I can find the basics of product strategy. I know I have a ton. As a matter of fact, I have a stakeholder interview thing here too. Let me find it. Where is it? I swear it's somewhere in here. Okay, I have one here on storytelling that I think would be helpful. And there's a product strategy one. Okay, here we go. These are it. Okay, so we have a product strategy here, and then you have a storytelling piece here. Right. I think those 3 articles will help get you on your way. I'd love for you to take a read and write some notes based on some of those questions. And then I'm going to email you a link for office hours with me. You book some time and we can talk through what your questions are and get a bit more in depth because we'll have about 30 minutes to talk through what you're saying. But I think just to say the general thing here, it's a problem that a lot of companies have, right? You're not alone in this. And what I think it boils down to is that the customer things are things you can see. And if you don't know where you're trying to go, or if you have or if everybody has a different version of where they're trying to go in their heads, what ends up happening is, right, the nearest thing seems like progress. And it can not be progress at all. And then that has downstream effects, as you mentioned, right? If you're always building different things, how do you measure anything? Because each thing that you're building is not, it could be disconnected from the other things down the path. Earlier, we talked about leading and lagging indicators. You can't really build those, or you can't really tell that story or have a map of metrics together without some clarity, what's some connection, some linkage. And I think the first step to, and I think the reason why I say that is the first step here is just asking them, is it's a really low stakes way, right? Everybody has an opinion. You're not saying what they need to do. You're really just asking them, okay, so I just want to know just to get a better understanding of where you see the product. And people will happily talk about that. And once you get that down and talk to the stakeholders and just see where they are, it's a lot easier to have these follow-up conversations because now you have some sort of anchor that you can build off of.
Thanks, Adu. I'll go through these articles and I'll reach out to you. Yeah.
Outstanding. And I think, unfortunately, that is it. That takes us to 58. I want to thank you all for joining today. Next month, we will be doing this again. Look out for another email at some point soon that'll say, hey, join us for February. I hope you will. I hope you will invite a friend. Feel free to bring a friend. And thank you all for joining me and sharing what you shared. You have a great week, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Bye.
Bye.